So I'm going to hit. And my pleasure now to hand over to Lawrence for introducing this session.
Thank you. In some ways, I'm not sorry it's a smaller group, although I'm glad we're recording it. But I would very much like, I hope, to be able to stimulate some discussion. Last week, I think for all of us was something of a shock in the sense that the extreme difficulty of the text was something even I was unprepared for. And it's a text that I know, but I had forgotten. And it would be barely an exaggeration to say that I have spent probably most of the last week, therefore, reworking the text and trying to understand what it was that we failed to address last week and that we need to address, or rather, I think that we should be open to addressing. To do that has required, I feel actually, I mean, I'll be completely honest with you. I feel like I'm about to walk into an exam. You know, that sense of butterflies in your stomach. You don't know quite what's going to come up. I've covered an most enormous amount of ground, and I know that I can't present it all to you in the time that's been allotted. Aaron and I discussed this at some length, and that's why Aaron suggested I give an extended introduction and that we record it. But it's not going to be a systematic introduction. In fact, that's exactly where I want to begin with what I think in this text is crucial is Heidegger's challenge to the question of system. The contemporary understanding of philosophy is that we approach philosophy as if it were always systematic. We've become accustomed to this. We read the ancient philosophers as if they were already systematic, when in fact they're anything but. But since Kant, we presuppose that system is at the basis of all thinking. Heidegger himself disrupts that. And he disrupts it radically, not so much in his short texts, but rather in the vast amount of work that went, the engine, if you like, of thinking that went into the possibility of those short texts. I often wonder what people made of them at the time, because they are so Delphic without having access to the vast amount of information that's in the background that is driving these texts. And yet that information or those thoughts, and they're highly worked thoughts, only began to appear really with the Beiträge zur Philosophie from 1989 onwards. And it would be fair to say that they've only been present in a large-scale way, probably since about 2010. Some of the texts that I want to quote from today only appeared in 2020, in particular, a series of lectures. But I want to begin, therefore, by revisiting Heidegger as an unsystematic thinker. That is to say, somebody who is actively attempting to undo the system, the way in which thinking itself is understood to be systematic. Now, why would that be necessary? The idea that the systematic prepares us in advance for anything that we encounter is, that is to say, for understanding anything that we encounter, is a supremely Aristotelian and Kantian thought. It's the thought that underpins the categories themselves. The fact of the idea that there is something there which can then be brought to its determinations drives the whole of the first critique. But it implicitly drives Aristotle's own speculations on metaphysics, in the metaphysics, and to some extent in the physics as well. And Heidegger proceeds in the opposite direction. That is to say, he begins, but one could overstate this. He begins with what is present itself, das Seiende. So let me begin myself, therefore, with a few provocations. One of the reasons why I think Heidegger is so difficult to read and to understand, well, there are two reasons, but one is that, to be blunt, and we are all involved in this, there is no criticism in what I'm about to say. To be blunt, we are ill prepared to read Heidegger. We are ill prepared to read Heidegger because he himself does not help us into his texts. That is to say, it's taken me years to work out what I think Das Seiende actually means. And about the only thing I can say to you in terms of what it means is that translating Das Seiende as beings is about the most unhelpful way of translating it possible. And I've become more and more convinced of that, especially as Aaron and I have begun work on a translation recently, where Aaron deliberately chose a section that addresses this issue of whether ta'onta should be translated as die Seienden, the plural of ein Seiendes, or a being, rather than das Seiende, which is the abstract noun. But there are many other places in which the translation of Heidegger into English, in my personal opinion, acts as a formal impediment to understanding how we are to read him. And this is going to remain a problem in Heidegger scholarship, I think, for decades. It's not going to be solved easily. There is no way round struggling with the German. But there is also, even when you have access to the German, there is no way around, in my opinion, struggling with how the German is to be understood, even if your own German is quite good. And I can give you no comfort there. There are some who would say that such a task is not worth the candle, as it were. But my own view is quite the reverse. In fact, it is precisely this project, the Heidegger and the Classics and Classical Thought project, which has refreshed and brought forth, for me at least, and I hope for many of you as well, an understanding of Heidegger which is quite revolutionary, even compared to the way I understood him before. And I thought that I had begun to understand him before we began this project in 2018. The return, as it were, to the early Greeks has opened up a way of reading Heidegger, which I think illustrates that it is impossible to understand, especially the later, but even the earlier Heidegger, without recourse to the Greeks. That presents all sorts of problems of its own, as many of us will be aware. Many of us did not have an educational background which gave us access to Greek. And even the background that those of us who do have that educational access had, can itself to some extent be an impediment. I was not taught Greek in this way, but I was taught Latin by somebody who spent a great deal of time haranguing us for taking too seriously the dictionary definitions, even as he expected us. In fact, he had strongly advised us on the one day a week we had off when I was studying most intensely with him, to spend Sunday afternoons with the dictionary on our laps and just read the dictionary page by page. But you'll get the point. The Heidegger and Classical Thought project, therefore, has brought before us, both Aaron and myself, but also in the discussions that we've had with many of you, the sheer intensity of Heidegger's engagement from about 1932 onwards, with a whole range, not only of classical texts, but classicists themselves. This brings us to the second area of difficulty, which I only want to touch on very glancingly. But the concern over Heidegger's politics and the disruption of the Second World War has also, in particular, the disruption that meant that a large number of classicists who were classified as racially Jewish under the Nuremberg laws, whether they themselves saw themselves like that or not, represents a fundamental caesura in the possibility of understanding Heidegger and understanding him well, not least because many of those individuals who were exiled from their own country in the most cruel way, and that's to say if they survived, bore the most strongest resentments towards somebody who certainly appeared, if not actually had, thrown in their lot with the regime almost from the very first day of Hitler taking power in 1933. And that has to be taken seriously. There is no way around it. One has to confront it. I've written about it myself. Many of you will have your own, I'm sure, very strong views about it, and quite rightly so. Why this long preamble? Because of the difficulty of section 6 that we encountered last week, and because of the difficulty in unraveling it. In order to understand the section, I went to a number of texts. First of all, 2 lectures that were given in Rome in 1936. One, which is very well known, on Hölderlin, called Earth and Erde und Himmel. On the essence of poetry. And the second, hardly known at all, on Europe and German philosophy, which turned out to be an extremely important text indeed. As far as I can tell, only 3 people have looked at it with any detail. One is Jussi Bachmann, another is Charles Bambach, and a third is Mar Brackel. But none of them give a systematic exposition of it. And then a third lecture that was given in 1940 with Karl Reinhardt present. It simply says, and this lecture only appeared in 1940, in 2020, sorry, simply called Der Spruch des Parmenides, by which Heidegger is referring to fragment 3, to gar autonoe nestin te ke ene, for the same is for thinking as is for being. That's standard translation. You will know that you, in fact, I think I once counted at least 32 different translations of Heidegger's across his work of that text. It's the sort of thing I do. It's what you do. If you've been told by one teacher to spend the afternoon with a dictionary on your lap, then you get rather nerdy for the rest of your life. The lecture in 1940, which was given to a small circle in Freiburg, ends with the following sentence. And I'm saying this particularly because one of the things that I have in mind here is an important conversation that Alberto Moreiras and I have been having about the significance of Heidegger's work overall. And so I want to draw attention to this in the hope of continuing that really very, in my opinion, extremely important conversation between Alberto and myself, and possibly giving some of you the opportunity to get a sense of it and to add to it. Towards the end of the lecture in 1940, Heidegger says, Der Spruch des Parmenides ist die doch wesende Füge, in die Wahrheit über das Seiende gefügt ist, aus welcher Wahrheit alle Geschichte des Abendlands aufsteigt. Which I translate as follows. It's not translated, this text, so this is my own translation. The saying of Parmenides, fragment 3, is the still existing jointure, then the yet essencing jointure, in which the truth concerning what is present, das Seiende, is enjoined, if you like, is gefügen here you can take as well as a form of logein, of gathered. Gefügen and gathering must be the same thing. Aus welcher Wahrheit, from which truth all history of the West arises. It's possible to hear this, and to hear this about this as a statement about the history of the West itself. But in fact, spending some time, again, a kind of a Sunday afternoon pursuit, trying to understand what Heidegger means by Geschichte, it becomes clear that the one thing that he does not mean is the actual historiography. If you like, the facts, the dates, the rulers and the rules, the wars, the settlements, the times of peace, the states and failures of those states, and the rise and ebb of civilizations that litter the Western canon. He has no concern with this. In fact, absolutely none whatsoever. So what on earth does die Geschichte mean if it doesn't mean the facts and details? If it doesn't mean, as it were, what we were all taught that history does mean? And if any of you are historians, and some of you are, that's probably where you begin. If history does not mean the actual historiography, and this is a background to the whole of section 6, then what is meant here is the how of being. In this case, not das Sein, what is present, but das Sein itself. The means by which an individual, a people, a nation, call it what you will, encounters and can even encounter itself as having had a before and a where to. I don't mean a past and a future, but an already having been and a going to be that is what being is. Again, not the content and facticity of that being, but the how, the understanding that there is a we in being, and that that being is stretched across from a having been and a where to. And what is at issue in this, therefore, is what and how it is brought to presence through this. The lecture given on April the 2nd in Rome was entitled, as I've said, Hölderlin and the Essence of Poetry. It was absolutely crucial, I think, as background to the Heraclitus lectures of 1942 and 43. In that lecture, Heidegger raises a question that he had raised repeatedly at the point at which, just after, in fact, he resigned from the rectorate. Wer ist der Mensch? And then he replies, who is the human being? Who is man? Jener, der zeugen muss, was sei. To zeugen is a strange verb because it means to beget, except, so you could translate this as who is man? That one who begets himself in as much as he is. But this is nonsense. It makes no sense. Who is man, the human being? The one, I would suggest, who must attest to who it is he is. And then Heidegger asks, to what does he attest? The verb again is zeugen. And this is where the conversation with Alberto becomes so important. Because Heidegger replies, his character as belonging to the earth. The question here, therefore, is how it is, the how of our belonging to where we belong, which is brought before us as das Sein, but which we encounter through the presence that we actually are in that presence, das Seiende. There is a third term, and this is where I'm going to become somewhat unsystematic myself and simply try and draw attention to the issues that I think arise in section 6, which I'm then hoping will enable us to have a conversation about what section 6 means. So if I've raised before us the question of das Sein, of being itself, as something necessarily historical, but which makes no particular reference to the facticity of the historical, and das Seiende as that which refers to that which is, and therefore das Seiende is intimately linked to the question of the da, the here present, what is referred to in section 6 all the way through as die Gegenwärtige, the presently present, as it were, that which waits upon us. That's what Gegenwart actually means, the counterweight, that which waits with respect to us. But a third term appears, das Sein. Now, if you know Tom Sheehan's work, and I've had long conversations with Tom about this, Tom has argued consistently and with some justification that Heidegger is untidy and careless about a differentiation between these three terms. My own view, and I think section 6 actually bears this out, and that's what I hope we can reach today, as long as I don't go on too long. I'll wait for Aaron to fall asleep, in which case he'll berate me in private, and none of you will ever come back, but never mind. We'll do our best. But I think I hope today, if we achieve anything at all, we will achieve an understanding of how these three terms, das Sein, das Seiende, and das Sein, not only can be distinguished, but are necessarily distinguished, and always were distinguished for Heidegger in the same way. This is an ambitious thing, because you won't find, I can't think, by the way, of a single essay or work in the secondary literature that fully explains this. I mean, John may know, I don't know how much of a nerd John is, probably as big, at least as big as me, but I'm not sure. But John may know of some material. And Jussi Bachmann's recent book on in the Sunni series, edited by Denny Schmidt, it goes a long way towards it. But I haven't seen anyone actually carry this out formally. Not that I'm claiming any priority here. I'm simply trying to present to you what I have found. How are we to begin with Das Sein? We found Das Sein, those of you who were with us for the Parmenides and Anaximander discussion last year, on the first sentence of the first lecture. And yet it's a term which is Schwabian dialect, and I'm going to make the suggestion that it belongs really and initially and as part of the systematic challenge to Hegel. If we turn to the 1832 Logic, it was published in 1832. It was written or finished. It was a rewrite of an earlier volume on logic, and it has the subtitle, and certainly it did when it was published, Lehre des Seins with a Y by Hegel. If we turn to a remark early on in that volume about Parmenides, this is what we find from Hegel. This is Hegel. He says, the Eleatics were first to give voice to the simple thought of pure being, notable among them Parmenides, who declared it to be the absolute and sole truth. Absolute here is Hegel, as it were, moving his tanks onto Parmenides' lawn. In other words, Hegel is establishing a formal connection between himself and Parmenides in discussing this. Hegel continues, in his surviving fragments, he did it, that's Parmenides, with the pure enthusiasm of thought, Denken, which has for the first time apprehended itself in its absolute abstraction. Only being is, and nothing is not absolutely. Only being is taken straight from the fragments, and nothing is not absolutely is Hegel's reworking of a phrase of Parmenides. The German text reads, das Sein with a Y ist, und das Nichts ist gar nicht. My suggestion to you is, if we are going to make the distinctions that we need to make to separate out these three terms and therefore make sense of section 6, we have to translate das Sein ist with the following words, ta me dunon pote, that which never sinks away. And we have to translate und das Nichts ist gar nicht with the words amtis lather, inasmuch as it is concealed. What do I mean by this? Very early on, in fact, when we looked at the Sophist lectures in 2018 and 2019, we discovered Heidegger's discussion of the way in which the Greeks understood being out of constant presence, ständige Anwesenheit. Throughout Heidegger's oeuvre, he constantly refers to the presence of Anwesen, presencing as a verb, and Anwesenheit, ständige Anwesenheit, in its role in Greek thinking. So where and how is this to be understood? My suggestion to you is that ständige Anwesenheit is also a correct translation of to me dunon pote, that which never sinks away. That is to say that the human being, the human soul, is secured in its understanding of its understanding on the fact that it never sinks away, that for itself, and insofar as it grasps itself as to me dunon pote, which is tantamount to ständige Anwesenheit. Ständige Anwesenheit, however, becomes the way in which the Greeks understand, especially through Plato and Aristotle, the divine, to theon. Now, to theon with an I means the godlike. It doesn't mean to theon, the god, as it were, or there is no, in fact, neuter God as far in Greek without it. So the divine, to theon, that realm within which the divine would have to live, is understood as athanatos, without death. The athanatos must therefore be a good candidate, and that's Heidegger's argument, for ständige Anwesenheit, for constant presence. And it's therefore for that reason that the ousia, or as it were, the epikeina, the beyond, wherein the ideas have their formal meaning for Plato, are referred to that place which is constant in its presenceness. But Heidegger is always trying to establish the phenomenological basis for what is said, so that even the epikeina, the beyond, the over there, which is epikeina tesousias, is beyond present being, beyond what is actually immediately present for us, would have to be secured if it's to be effectively understood on the basis of to me dunon pote, of the never sinking away. And so that one can see here right from the start, and this is what we've been prepared for all the way through the first 5 sections of this second lecture and through the first set of lectures, we've been prepared for the way in which constant presence is understood first and foremost as a feature of the human soul. Why are we speaking of the human soul? I don't want to go into a great detail. We did so, and I think successfully last week, on the character of the human soul, as it were, the psyche as breathing and as that going in and going out, which marks the tov me dunon pote, the never sinking away, which lets, as it were, the never sinking, or which the never sinking away lets be understood. But what is really absolutely clear here is that Hegel's understanding of constant presence is also secured as an understanding of thinking, denken. And it is this that enables us to gain some understanding of das Sein. So I'm going to make a number of outrageous suggestions. I'm aware the time is running on, and I know that Aaron's shaking his head, so he's at least giving me permission to bore you all a bit longer. But these are the connections, the unsystematic connections that I want to make. The fragment of Parmenides begins to gar auto, for indeed the same. When we posit the notion of the same, just by virtue of having named the same, we name that difference is in question, because the same posits the thought of difference in its being posited. Much Heidegger scholarship has become intensely preoccupied with, and Heidegger fed this to a certain extent, Heidegger's own determination to try and formally establish the ontological difference, that is, the difference between das Sein, between, if you like, being or presencing, depending on how you want to translate that, and das Seiende, what is present. If you are absolutely resolutely determined to disagree with me, then beings. And then all of a sudden, from 1932 onwards, Heidegger begins to ask the question, how do we secure, instead of the terms of the difference, rather the difference itself? And my suggestion to you is going to be that for the first time, we begin to get a sketch of how to understand das Sein. Denken as securing the difference itself, to gar auto, for the same, is thinking noein, if thinking is the correct correct translation for noein. But in fact, Heidegger challenges that in the 1940 lecture, at which Karl Reinhardt was present. But let's not go on a detour too far, too quickly. And enai, being. here Einai means das Sein, not das Seiende, being itself. So that thinking and being are in some sense gathered in the Autor. Now, this is the essence of the lecture that was, or of the essay that appeared, I think, if I remember rightly, in Vorträge und Aufsätze in 1953. But in fact, the lecture of 1940 makes it much clearer. And Aaron and I are hoping to make a scratch translation of the lecture of 1940 in order to make this available. But we begin to see, therefore, that what Heidegger is, when Heidegger says he wants to think not the terms of the difference, das Sein and das Seiende, but the difference itself, and that difference is to be understood in this way, as das Sein, and therefore as Wahrheit des Seins, then we begin to understand that the truth of being, Wahrheit des Seins, being with a Y here, is understood as some kind of a relation. The word that we normally translate is as relation in German is Bezug. You'll be well aware that Bezug is all over section 6 as we go through it. But Bezug can be translated as translation, as relation, but it's a little more complicated than that. Einzug is a train, something that pulls something. The relation here is not one that's posited or that we put there, but it's rather one that gathers itself to itself in virtue of itself. It's a pull. It's a need. In fact, if we're to, there isn't the time to explicate it, but if we are to understand that other term, which becomes that shadowy and difficult term that is still yet to be fully discussed, I think, in the secondary literature, der Brauch, which is sometimes translated as need, but which those of you who know your Heidegger well will know Heidegger says is the oldest name for being, Prey, in the Anaximander fragment essay that appeared in 1950. Then you get some idea of what is being named here. Brauch, Krei, Bezug, the need that gathers to itself. I hope, therefore, that you're beginning to hear how it is that the connection between logos, capital lambda, and logos, small lambda, are gathered together and shown to be the same and one and the same. To, gar, auto, homolegein, in section 6 of the lectures that we're currently studying. So, to add to this, we then discover the word diaphora, which Heidegger also extracts, diapherein, from two of the fragments. Doing this from memory, because my notes are sketchy from, I think it's 48 and 72, but I can't remember. But a key discussion here, therefore, from fragment 72, is the word dianikes, the continuous, the unbroken, that which goes across from to. Here, again, we should hear a crucial word of Parmenides, not Heraclitus, suniches, or sunechis, I always pronounce it badly, the continuous. These are one and the same word, as it were, belonging together, where there is a going across to from, which Heraclitus calls a dia, a going across to from, and Parmenides calls sun, already together, already with. So that diapherein and sunechis say, in fact, the same thing. And then the word that Heidegger uses repeatedly of this is both ris, the rip that looks back, and the rip, as it were, the tear that looks forward, the clift, the rift. Earlier in the Beiträge, for instance, he calls this at length the Zerklüftung. But it's in the Zerklüftung that the Da of Dasein appears, which in section 6 he also calls an Austrag. Austrag is one of those words which it's been almost impossible to render into English. It can mean settlement in the sense of the outcome of a dispute, or it can mean a discharge or an emission or even an export. But the Austrag is that which is borne out, that which is carried out, but not something which is effected, but rather something which is the effect of a going out. We considered earlier the notion of the soul. Miles Groth reminded us not long ago when I started to talk about the self, that there is no I in Heidegger, he said. It was an important reminder. But I did turn up, therefore, in the volume that succeeded the Beiträge, Heidegger's discussion of Selbstheit. And this is where I want to end, at least in the hope of provoking a discussion. Because Selbstheit and das Sein turn out to belong together. In fact, in some crucial sections from 51 to 54 of Besinnung, the volume that succeeded the Beiträge, where das Sein with a Y and der Mensch, humanity or man, is discussed. We see this Bezug, this Bezwischen, this between, which is named in section 6, not once or twice, but constantly discussed. What is at issue here? What's at issue here is the soul, as it were, as a kind of activity, not an animal activity, but that constant going out and going off and running off, what in repeated texts Heidegger calls an Irren or an Irrweg, a running off, running into error, running out and around. If you know your Descartes, you'll know that this is exactly how Descartes describes the origins of the will in the human being. But Heidegger turns this inside out, such that the human soul is pulled out in every direction and struggles, in fact, to unify itself, to keep, as it were, to keep a steer on itself, to hold itself within a certain kind of constancy. So that the top me do non pote, that which never sinks away, also carries within it a going back and forth, an instability, a rushing out in every direction, an austragen, an outbearing. And so I'm going to conclude in the hope that we can elaborate some of the points with just returning you to page 304. This is Aaron page 10 of section 6, where this is the Jürgen and Assayante translation. The Suche, says Heidegger in this translation, has several, indeed many extremities, many paths of going out, all of which are meant, every perceiving, every visualization, every willing, every remembering, every bethinking, every beholding is a striving, a movement towards, the being underway of a way. Every sojourning is a pause on the bearing of paths. Later on, Heidegger talks about this as a bearing, Tagen, which goes on within the soul, so that the Austragen and the Tagen of the activity of the soul should be seen as connected. But all of this is an Inzwischen, an in-between, which is also a Bezug. And all of this, in fact, is Denken. Denken as vornehmen, as appropriating, taking into oneself, which at the same time is what is named as noein in the to gar auto noein estin, te ke ene. So that what one should hear in this is that the to gar auto is the name of das Sein, for the way in which the to gar auto noein estin confronts what actually is with respect to its being. So that you see we have for the first time, at least in outline, a connection between these three terms, das Sein being itself, das Seiende, what is immediately present, and das Sein. In Besinnung, Heidegger makes the following observation. He says, nie gehört eines dem Sein. There is not one thing that belongs to Sein with a Y. Selbst eingangbar ist es, nichts von Seiendem als ein solcher. It's nothing to do with the going out and about, as it were, of any particular or given present situation of being. What are we to understand by this? We're to understand a formal distinction between das Sein, as it were, as the thinking of that which gathers the ontological difference, and the terms of the difference, the being of being, das Sein des Seiendes, as it were, the being of what is actually present. So I appreciate, and I'm very grateful to you for listening to what will, I'm sure, have been, may even have felt something like a bombardment of complexity. And if I say that I've only managed to tell you about 1/10 of what I'd hoped to tell you, but nevertheless, I hope I've shown that in section 6 of these lectures, Heidegger, I think, allows us to at least glimpse the fundamental connections between thinking the difference itself and thinking what is differed in the difference. And that this is, if I've understood it correctly, what is most necessary to understand if we're to unravel what section 6 actually means. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I don't think anyone will begrudge you. I think that was quite a welcome bombardment. Would it be naive, and I'm going to shoot myself in the foot a little bit here, but it seems the obvious question is to ask, if we're talking about this relation between das Sein, and das Sein, and we're looking in the context of section 6 in Heraclitus, are we simply mapping onto the terms logos with a small lambda, logos with a big lambda, and the homologane, those specific terms?
I mean, if I can be cheeky enough to rephrase your question slightly, the question I've been asking myself for all week as I've been trying to think this through is what's worked out in the Beiträge and Besinnung, so from 1936 to 1939, a way of explaining Heraclitus? Or did the understanding of Heraclitus make possible what Heidegger unfolded in the Beiträge and Besinnung? And I think the answer is the latter, not the former. And the reason I say that is because the more that I trace the different, I mean, I'm slightly against that kind of Heidegger scholarship that says, on Wednesday afternoon in 1935 at 2:40 p.m. he had cornflakes, and at the same time he thought out Das Ereignis for the same time. Because I think it's highly dangerous. I mean, as Robert Bernasconi wrote in a text that he published in, I think, 2005 or 2006, which warned Heidegger scholars that very often when you think you found the date on which something kind of came to Heidegger, you discover he was thinking it all along, and in fact he was thinking it a lot longer before. But I genuinely now think that what is the fundamental working out is the lectures that we went through last year, the Parmenides and Anaximander lectures, and that the Heraclitus interpretation went on all the way through the 30s. And that whilst, as it were, what we have in the 1942 and 43 pair of lectures is a culmination, it's a pinnacle, which is why it's so difficult. Nevertheless, its fundamental terms were worked out, and they were the unlocking that made possible the then more formal presentation that appears in the Beiträge and the Besinnung. That I think that's right. Even if
just play devil's advocate, then I mean the Beiträge came out what 4 or 5 years before the Heraclitus lectures, so
I thought they came out the same year actually.
oh, did they? Oh, sorry.
I mean,
GA55.
GA55 came out in what? I can't remember when it was actually published.
Oh, no, in the lectures given. I mean, if Heidegger's already thinking about the relation between logos, well, Dasein, Daseinde, and Dasein.
Yeah.
When was the Beiträge published?
It was published in 89, but it was written between 36 and 38.
Right. So that's 5 years then before these lectures were given.
Yes, if not longer.
Yeah. So why would he write that? Would we not expect these Heraclitus lectures to be worked out and then worked out in the context of the Beiträge?
Why? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I mean, I think. I mean, it's a. No, I think that the fundamentals were derived off these three early thinkers.
I completely agree with that, because I think when we were looking at J35 last year, you've almost got the raw ingredients there for thinking this through, and I think this is what I was trying to bring out a little bit last week. Is you've got the paths of Parmenides, you've got the first way and the third way, and this seems to the homologein and then Dasein seems to be the way to work out, almost the way to navigate. The walk in the third way while keeping aware of the signs of the stomata of the first way.
Yes. I mean, I think that holding together in those sections in Besinnung where he discusses das Sein und der Mensch, being with a Y, and the human being, by which therefore we have to think really of the soul. It's Suche that's meant, and Suche in the sense of the Suche of the De Anima. And so, I mean, I've always thought that Sein und Zeit itself takes its lead as a form of the De Anima, and that the essential province within which the Beiträge and the Besinnung are written is still the De Anima, is still concerning the soul, and concerning the soul not based on what Aristotle wrote, but based on the province within which Aristotle was writing, if that makes sense. He constantly contrasts das Sein, the inzwischen, the in-between, with the Da of Dasein, so that the Da of Dasein is the Zerklüftung, it's the opening up of the difference within which the in-between then thinks. And this is where I think Anaximander is absolutely crucial, because the question that emerges in Anaximander is, why does Heidegger constantly assert that the whole fragment is about das Sein? It's because Genesis and Thora would only make sense as that which both comes to be and passes away within the inzwischen, the in-between. And so therefore it's only if you've understood the human being as the Wahrheit des Seins, and he calls that at one point, he calls the human being the Wächter, the guardian, if you like, or the watcher, the one who has custodianship of that difference. That such a genesis and Thora, coming to be and passing away, could actually occur. In other words, the Anaximander interpretation, there's a reason why that das Sein, I don't know if it was put there in 1932, but if it was added later, it was added to the first sentence to give a clue to how the Anaximander fragment, if you remember, the Anaximander fragment is the one that's dealt with first. We didn't deal with it that way, but that's where we begin. You would have to understand das Sein in order to understand coming to be and passing away. You're Alberti, I think you need to put your mic.
He's primed. Oh, Alberti, you're on mute. Oh.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lawrence. That was great. And thank you, Aaron, for your questions. Of course, there are many things that we could develop on the basis of what you said, Lawrence, and I don't mean to reduce them to one of my responses, which I am going to produce now, which is only one of my responses. Yeah, I also thought, 2.6, in other words, the reading for today is extremely important, okay? And it does have, those difficulties that you pointed out. And certainly one of the things that is really important is this relationship to the divine that would not be a religious relationship. That seems to me very crucial and not pointed out enough in the secondary literature on Heidegger. This notion of the staying as the in-between, the Inzwischen, is very important in that sense. But I want to point out, the perplexity that comes up when Heidegger, towards the end of section 6, initiates, a certain critique of the early thinkers, including Heraclitus, when he says that they intuit the enigmatic nearness of being. Remember, that's in page 47. Aning is the verb he uses. They intuit the enigmatic nearness of being. At that point, he's discussing what he calls the ursprüngliche Unterschied, the originary difference between beings and being. He says, Heraclitus and the early thinkers intuit it. And then in page 52, we have the fairly astonishing and prophetic parenthetical remark. When he says that one day, I'm trying to find it in my notes. Well, one day, thinking after Logos more originally than Heraclitus. Remember that?
Yes. I think I know the passage you're trying to quote. It's where he says, one day we will need to come to. They had no word for das Sein, he says.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we will have to learn to think it more originarily.
Yeah,
I think it's the very last sentence of page 256 in the English translation in the book,
which could be in the Aaron
344.
Is this Aaron page 44?
44? Oh, 44, really?
No, page 52 at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
52.
Thank you.
Right.
You were right first time.
Yes. We will one day have to think after the Logos in a more originary way, more originally even than Heraclitus did. Well,
yeah.
I think that those two things, the fact that he's interpreting Heraclitus, but he has something in mind that exceeds Heraclitus.
Yeah.
And I think that's what creates the difficulty in this section, don't you think?
I agree. And so in that lecture from 1940, which as far as I can tell, no one's taken any notice of at all, Der Spruch des Parmenides, where there's a fascinating, this is the one that Aaron and I are going to try and produce a scratch translation of. There's a fascinating discussion of the relationship of the early Greeks to both Nietzsche and to Hegel. And then he says that it's a similar sense. He says that the early Greeks concentrate in thinking aletheia, in what is unverborgen, what is unconcealed, without any reference to what is concealed. And he says, does this matter? And he says, in one way, no, because they take for granted the concealed, such that for them, unconcealment is I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's essentially they take for granted that unconcealment springs from the concealed in a way that we are unable to think. And that's where he also discusses the question of thinking itself. So he says in a similar point in the lecture that thinking, we can only think thinking as the act of a subject, he says. And then he makes it clear, he's trying to unravel the notion of thinking, the direct translation between thinking and knowing. He says that, but the apprehension of what is there to be apprehended as what is apprehensible. So he's speaking of the three, the das Sein, and das Sein, in their interconnectedness, is to be thought of as essentially, and this is me taking a shortcut, as what thinks us, as what gives us to think. Now, this, I mean, I hope this makes sense in terms of your question, because this is, I think, the more originary thinking. That is to say, the most originary thinking will be able to thematize and bring to the fore the concealed as it in its own presencing in relation to the unconcealed, which the early Greek thinkers take for granted, but are themselves unable to thematize.
Yeah.
And he says it's because they're unable to thematize it that from thence onwards, this was misunderstood and indeed covered over, even by their immediate successors. And he uses the word Missdeutung, misunderstood.
Yeah, so it is the harmonia hafanes, right? The inconspicuous jointure that he has glossed before, you know?
Yes, yeah. That's
that
absolutely,
is at stake here.
That's absolutely what is at issue.
Right, and so he wants us to engage with, in fact, what is withdrawing in that inconspicuous juncture. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And that is what he proposes as, in fact, the region of divinity, which I would like to associate with the notion of the hora, mm-hmm. In those beautiful pages in which Heidegger discusses the
horismos.
Yeah, exactly. The hora, the horismos, the horizon, the horismenos, all of that stuff. Mm. And then he says, it is the surrounding that surrounds. Mm.
Yes.
The surrounding that surrounds. Mm.
Yeah.
The surrounding that surrounds, which is somehow other than logos with a capital L, right? Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
The nearest, I think, that he sees the early Greeks as naming this is Anaximander in naming adikia in relation to decay. So adikia is the chaos, the primordial disjointure, the unfug, from which Fügung, jointure, is grasped. So the question even there is the Fügung of the Unfug grasped with respect to itself? Does it join for itself? Or do we join it? But those questions ask about the Sichereignen of Ereignis, the self-eventuating of Ereignis, it seems to me.
So I wonder if you are ready to say a few things about the difference between religion, the Heideggerian concept of religion, which of course he connects to religare, and he connects to ontology. And this something else that he is trying to unconceal. In other words, our relationship to the inconspicuous concealment is not of a religious nature, because it is not ontological, it is pre-metaphysical, right?
Yeah.
So where do we go from there? In other words, what's the task? If we want to follow this intuition that one day there will be another beginning.
Is it mere temporal succession that there will one day be another beginning? I mean, that's a question that's always beset me about. Is not the Anfang. One of the other texts that I've been looking at is a throwaway remark that Heidegger makes in the first of the Black Notebooks, and I think I have it to hand. And the way that Rochewitz translates it, and I mean, this isn't a criticism of Rochewitz, but so Heidegger says, wie weit nach vorne sind die Griechen über uns Weg geschritten? How far, and Rochewitz has, how far advanced are the Greeks over us? But in fact, this actually says, how far further beyond us have the Greeks already stepped on the way ahead? In other words, it's not that we're racing the Greeks. It's not a direct competition between us and the Greeks, but rather they are still showing us the way ahead because they were able to get a way ahead in a way that we've not yet worked out how we can. So he then says, zu ihnen gibt es daher keinen Rückgang, which Rochewitz says, there is accordingly no returning to them, sondern nur ein Einholen, only a catching up. But again, I want to translate this as, to them, there is hence no going back. In other words, the Greeks don't look over their shoulder as they surpass. And so that sondern nur ein Einholen should be translated as, but only as surpassing. The Greeks are as surpassing. It's not that they're surpassing in relation to us or jeering at us as they rush past us. And then he says, but this requires the strength. This is the rest of my translation, which I won't bore you with the German, but this requires the strength of a throwing oneself forward within an origin surpassing questioning. That, however, means only to unfetter here being for the humanity of its day. Now, the German is highly ambiguous because it's im heutigen Menschen. Now, does that mean that, but the Greeks also have their own day. And so, in other words, we want to sort of set these inceptions up as if they're in sequence, but in fact, if we think time as a circularity, and we think of the ion that each of us is granted as our allotted gift of time, then we're not actually in competition with each other, but rather we are co-presencing, even when we are co-presencing with those who are long gone and yet still profoundly influential over us. I mean, that seems to me to be the right way to think this through, rather than, a sort of because implicit in this first beginning and other beginning as something that's set against each other is actually, it seems to me, a very Christian thought, which is the parousia, the end of times.
Mhm.
But I don't think the Greeks have a sense of the end of times, and I don't think we need one, even in order to think the divine. Because in order to think the end of times, one then ends up thinking of time as in the power or in the hand of the God. But it's not clear to me that, it's not even clear actually that biblical Christianity or biblical Judaism thinks in this way. I mean, Michael may have some words to say about that, but that's not my own reading of either the Hebrew Bible or of the early Christian appropriation of time. It only comes later.
I was just thinking, Lawrence, of that passage in GA 95 where Heidegger talks about the task of thinking ahead of us. I've just put in the quote in the chat box where he says, and this is a scratch translation: the oldest thinkers were permitted to say the truth of what is directly. The more recent ones could pronounce the correctness of the human representation. Those of the future must learn to, and then it's Erdenken, so I'm not sure how to translate that. Dasein, the school for this learning is Dasein, with a hyphenated Dasein.
I just want to come back to Alberto's question, because I mean, I think you picked up on one aspect of it, which is the other beginning. But I took Alberto's question in a more general way. Maybe I mistook it, but that's I heard. I'm also curious about what would be a Heideggerian conception of this non-ontological conception of religion, or whatever you want to call it, the divine, the holy, something like that. Perhaps I misunderstood Alberto, but I don't think he was only asking about the notion of another beginning, which is very interesting. Said about
that. Well, look at page 36, a very interesting quotation that I think goes to the heart of what Lawrence was presenting at the beginning of our session today. When Heidegger talks about the pure relation without origin, the pure relation without origin. Is this pure relation without origin is connected to what Lawrence called the divine. Okay. Of course, that creates the possibility of an understanding of the divine, which is not ontotheological, right? And it seems to me that even though there is no parousia, there is no end of times, there is no waiting for the final judgment in Heidegger, he constantly talks, particularly in the Beiträge, if I remember correctly, he constantly talks about the future ones, the coming ones, which doesn't seem to me like, it's an apocalyptic understanding, but he's just saying, we need to come to terms with this pure relation without origin. Saying, right? When we come to terms with this pure relation without origin, things will change. There will be a transformation of thinking. And that transformation of thinking, it is unclear to me whether Heidegger thinks it is a personal one, or in fact it can project itself into the social, okay, into the political realm. Okay, that's very unclear to me. The Beiträge is very ambiguous about that. And I think this is connected to, Heidegger's unfortunate involvement with the Nazis,
I don't read this text in the way that you're reading it. I don't read logos here as a reference to God. In fact, quite the reverse.
Not logos, but not logos, but something else. I mean, what surrounds.
But the relation without origin is being itself.
Yes.
This is straight Parmenides. It has nothing to do with anything divine. The divine can appear within this, but this is itself not divine. This isn't an understanding of the athanatos, because it isn't even deathless. As having no origin, it also has not even a characterization with respect to time.
So is the pure relation then the presencing of what is present?
Well, I think it's what he calls das Einen, the oneing. The oneing is the unifying that constantly makes itself present as the possibility of the belonging together of in fact a kind of a fourfold of Dasein, das Sein, das Sein, das Seiende. But this isn't, I mean, the Greeks also have this, do they not? I mean, the Greeks have this sense that even the gods are subject to fate.
Moira, yeah.
You know, in other words, because I mean, you'd have to explain it to me, Alberto, but I can't see a connection there.
Well, the gods, yes, but
the
not...
Nazis. Where are the Nazis?
No. The Nazis is precisely in the difficulty of figuring out whether this transformation of thinking is a personal one, is a transformation of the thinker, or if it projects itself into the social. But we can leave that aside, because it seems to me what is more important.
I get it now. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
I think what is more important really is that understanding of the relation between relations, which then he calls pure relation without origin. Because this pure relation without origin could also be called time, no?
Yes, I think absolutely it's time. It's time in the, but it's the time in the sense that of that time which belongs to being. In other words, it's the time which has no time, but which gives time.
The cosmos, as he puts it in the 1943 seminar. But isn't that cosmos the divine?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
That's where, you know, I mean, I think that's where I found myself at issue with people like Richard Capobianco have wanted to name that as the divine. It's not. It's the possibility of the divine appearing. You know, and he's explicit about that in the 50s. You know, he says that rather naughty remark that he makes to the old Bultmannians. You know, he says, some of you know that I came from theology, and he's teasing them. He's saying, because you always want to know what I think about God. So he says, you know, some of you know that but let me tell you, if I were to write a theology, the word being would not appear in it.
Yes, but I think that can be a bit distracting. If you forget the word divine or God, what about the word holy or sacred or something like that? Because we tend to think of the divine and God in terms of entities and so forth. But the question is whether this being which makes possible the divine is itself already holy.
Well, he talks about the divine as a dimension, doesn't he? I mean, and the word he uses there is charis, charisma. And so he says that a God can only emerge from that dimension, which is from wherein the holy is understood. But charis, therefore, is a dimension in being, but it's not a dimension. It's not a dimension in the sense that it has dimensions, but rather it is. I mean, and that's part of the fourfold, isn't it? I mean, it is the interrelationship between. I mean, he sees this in Greek terms as the interrelationship between thnetos, being mortal, and being athanatos, being deathless. But that names no God as such. I mean, it's simply it's simply that which already opens up within the da of Dasein itself. Here, da is not considered in any sense human.
But for me, there's some progress here, in my understanding at least, if I'm understanding, And that would be to say that whatever non-ontological concept of religion Heidegger is, if he is pointing to, is one in which, so there is no, it's a religion without God, if you like. It's a sense of the holy without a God, or prior to a God, to any God.
Well, it's neither prior nor posterior in the sense that it's part of this Einen, das Einen, which is named here as Alberto says, the relation between relations, a pure relation without origin and only this.
Because, whatever the divine is, it is not a being, right? So should we understand it? Should we understand it as relation, precisely? A relation without origin.
Well, my anxiety about that as is that it glues too easily terms that have been used in, let's say, the various mystical traditions onto what is being said here. But I genuinely don't think anything is being said here about the divine. And that's what Heidegger himself also said. And he didn't just say it once or twice, he said it repeatedly. Because let's say I don't think this is what you're trying to do with it, but a certain, let's say, theologically minded mind kept trying to hunt down the connection between Heidegger and God, which I think he was entertainingly involved in avoiding being taken down. Except that there are the discussions of the last God all the way through the Beiträge and Besinnung. But in that sense, he doesn't avoid it. But he doesn't want to be, he's emphatic and absolutely emphatic, and not once, but over and over again, that being and God cannot be connected.
Right, because God is not a being, which is...
No, it's because God is neither a being nor being.
Right.
But he still wants to hold on to the possibility of something to which you might, of the possibility, not to which, but of the possibility of what he calls prayer and dance and so forth. And that's the thing that interests me, even without the God.
I mean, most of those things I think are asides. I mean, they're not things that one can be. They're not things that one can derive very much from. He's simply there. For instance, that reference to dance in Identität und Differenz he's jeering at those who want to reduce God to certain things. He says this is the metaphysical God is neither a God to whom one can pray nor dance before. But I think that's just a jibe. I don't think that's meant to be taken systematically.